Good afternoon, and thank you for joining me. Happy Pride. My name is Quinten Foster. I use he, they pronouns, and I am the director of Transgender Whole Healthcare at East Bay Community Action Program. I am so delighted to be joining you today to talk about the history of Pride in the United States. Our discussion today is going to be relatively brief. It is very difficult to fit an entire country's history into one short presentation, even when we're just talking about a subset of the population, like the LGBTQIA plus community. So we're definitely not going to be able to talk about every single thing, and I encourage folks to hang out in the comments, talk about other events and figures and people that you are aware of in American queer history. So LGBTQIA plus progress. This is going to be an introduction to American queer history. I'm going to start with an abbreviated timeline. This is just a few of the important historical events and figures that are important to the LGBTQIA plus community in the United States. So the first example I like to give is all the way back in 1776. Here in Rhode Island, we have documented history of the Public Universal Friend. This person was a preacher who described themselves as genderless and did not use any gendered pronouns. They started a ministry in Rhode Island and really focused on making sure that everyone was included within their faith community. The next example I love to give from our past history is the example of William Dorsey Swan. So William Dorsey Swan was born in the 1850s, I believe, and was a person who was formerly enslaved. He obtained his freedom, and he was one of the most influential figures of that time period. He was the first known person in the United States who was known as a queen of drag or a drag queen in America. And his events focused on including queer community is the beginning of what we now call ballroom culture. And so we'll watch a short video on him after this slide. Then we get to the 1920s and 30s, where we see a lot of queer phobia, specifically in sort of Europe, Germany, with the Nazis, but this also expanded into other countries, including America. One of the events during this time that was really important was Magnus Hirschfeld. So he had this incredible institute of gender and sexuality, was one of the first places in the entire world that actually scientifically studied gender and sexuality and became the world's first gender clinic for transgender folks to get medical transition support. Unfortunately, this institute was destroyed by the Nazis. Many of the books and the research that were included there were burned. And around this same time, queer folks were targeted by the Nazis and forced into concentration camps. This is where we see the emergence of that upside down pink triangle for gay men and the purple triangle for lesbians. Then we get to the 1950s and we see a rise in McCarthyism. So queerness, among many other things like communism and socialism, was used as an accusation to invalidate and sometimes even imprison progressive figures across the world, but very, very prominently in the United States. Once we get to the 1960s, we see an expansion of dissent, almost. So at that time, queer expression and love were literally banned by law. It was a federal crime to be gay or to be queer. We start seeing uprisings as LGBTQIA plus folks reject the police brutality that they were subjected to, as well as the mistreatment that they experienced in their protection by the mob. And we'll see more in a couple of videos later on. And then finally, in 1969, we get to Stonewall. This is a very commonly understood event in the LGBTQIA plus history. It is known as a turning point, both here in the United States as well as sort of across the world. So in June of 1969, there was a riot at a New York City gay bar because the police came in and targeted queer folks. This was a very common event. Police targeted queer bars all the time at that time, but it was becoming more and more common. It was becoming more and more violent, and folks were starting to resist the idea that they were not allowed to wear incorrectly gendered clothing or participate in basic human dignity. So Stonewall was a riot. It lasted 3 days, and it is known as the birth of the gay rights movement in the United States. So I do want to tell you some more details about this key figure, William Dorsey Swann. As I said, he was a formerly enslaved person who was the first known to refer to himself as a queen of drag in the late 1800s. We're going to watch a video here learning more about his history and why he's so important to the LGBTQIA+ community.
Today, I'm taking you all the way back to the late 1800s to meet an enslaved person who became a queen. William Dorsey Swann was born into servitude and grew up to become one of the first American activists to spearhead a queer resistance group. He was also the first person known to refer to himself as a queen of drag. And that's not all. Swann was the first person to use the legal and political system to fight for the right of the queer community to gather in America. Ooh, exciting. Hi y'all, I'm Peppermint, New York City's delightful diva, and welcome to a special episode of Masters of Drag. We start our story on one fine spring night in April 1888. Swann was hosting one of his typical illicit dance parties at a Washington, D.C. dive, and the room was filled by dozens of black men dressed in women's silks and satins. The police were called, and when they barged in to shut down the party, the attendees scattered, rushing to pull off their wigs and even jumping out of windows. According to the National Republican newspaper, Swann was one of the few who didn't run. In fact, he reportedly stood up to the arresting officers and boldly declared, "You is no gentleman." This act of resistance started a brawl with the officers, in which Swann's cream-colored satin dress was allegedly ripped to shreds. Ah! Almost a dozen men escaped arrest, but another dozen, plus a half-naked Swann, were carted off to jail. Articles about the raid in various newspapers identified Swann as the Queen and described how hundreds of people followed the party guests down the road as police arrested them and took them to the local station. Now, if you Google William Dorsey Swann, you'll see this photo pop up. While we love it, it's not of Miss Swann. It's actually a photo of a different drag performer named Mr. Brown. That's because Swann was born in 1860, just 3 years before Abe Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation, when photos were rare. He came into this world enslaved, the property of a white woman who lived on a plantation in Washington County, Maryland. In the 1880s, some African Americans saw upholding traditional gender norms as a possible pathway to survive and thrive in the face of white violence. But not Swann. He was in his early 20s and began holding drag events. This was on the cutting edge of a cultural underground that was very taboo, no matter what color you were. His biographer, Channing Gerard Joseph, has pointed out that his 1888 arrest was one of the first known instances of resistance to queer oppression in American history. Swann banded together butlers, cooks, coachmen, and many other people in service who loved drag to attend his underground drag events. The drag parties would include singing, dancing, and a so-called cakewalk, where a hoe cake or a cornmeal pancake was awarded as a prize to the best dancer. The events were usually spread by word of mouth at places like the YMCA, and many who attended were also formerly enslaved, including Swann's lover, Pierce Lafayette. Now, it's important to recognize that drag in America, like other African American art forms, including genres of music and dance, came out of some of the torturous conditions of slavery, where communities came together in secret to find a semblance of joy and self-expression. Swann was no stranger to arrests and police stations. He was detained several more times for hosting his drag parties, which culminated in his detention and conviction in 1896 for keeping a disorderly house, a criminal charge often used against those who ran brothels, and sentenced to 300 days in jail. Swann wasn't taking it laying down. 3 months into his sentence, he petitioned President Grover Cleveland for pardon, writing in the petition he was a respectable worker with a long employment history. Ultimately, the Justice Department denied Swan's request, but it was still a historic move and a serve. In the late 1890s, Swan retired from the drag scene, and his younger brother, Daniel J. Swan, took over hosting the parties and helped dress drag performers in the DC community for almost 5 decades. The exact year of Swan's death remains unknown, but he leaves an undeniable legacy for his drag sisters and queer folk everywhere. Drag history is longer than most of us think, and we are only just beginning.
Thank you so much, Miss Peppermint, for a history lesson on William Dorsey Swan. I think this is an incredibly important example of how we can look at multiple different movements and how they interact with each other. William Dorsey Swan was not only important to LGBTQIA plus rights in general, he was also incredibly important for the later formation of transgender rights, and he was an incredibly important figure in Black history in America. What a wonderful story. All right, so some more abbreviated history. We'll go back to the timeline. After Stonewall, which we will hear more about after this slide, there was an explosion in support and revolution and movement towards acceptance for queer folks. So in 1970, 1 year after the Stonewall riots happened, we saw the Gay Liberation Front hold a protest parade in New York City. This was held in June to commemorate the anniversary of the Stonewall riot. This was the first celebration of Pride as we know it, and this is where this very complex idea of celebrating while pushing for progress comes into play. As time goes on, we see 1973, where homosexuality was removed from the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, essentially meaning that homosexuality was no longer considered a mental illness in the United States after that 1973 update. This is incredibly important when we think about medical care, access to all sorts of medical and psychological care for queer folks, but also later on the diagnostic processes that were important for accessing gender affirming care. Then we get into the 80s, and at this time, there was an incredibly important series of events going on with the LGBTQIA plus community. So unfortunately, especially in New York City, we saw a concentration of queer folks dying left and right. There was this new disease that everyone was terrified about. We didn't know how it spread or how to fix it, how to help people survive. And when folks were diagnosed, it was considered a death sentence for many years. So at first we called this GRID, gay-related immunodeficiency. And as the research improved, it became known as HIV. So HIV then develops into AIDS, which unfortunately is the more impactful version of the virus when it is really attacking the body. So over the course of the 80s into the 90s, we saw at first a complete lack of action on the government's part. There was very, very little science. There was very little money going towards research to support a cure for HIV and AIDS. Unfortunately, this inaction led to thousands of deaths that could have been potentially prevented or at least slowed and softened so that folks did not experience the absolute torture of dying from this unknown disease. Finally, we got some research, we got some medications, and folks stopped seeing AIDS as a death sentence. So in 1985 through 1987, we saw this incredible community art project called the AIDS Memorial Quilt. And this commemorated lives lost to HIV because of that stigma and government inaction. And we'll learn more about that in the video after this slide. So then we get to the early 90s. Unfortunately, this was a little bit of a rollback. So we saw in 1993, Don't Ask, Don't Tell being implemented. So this technically expanded military service to include folks who were gay or lesbian, so long as they hid their identities. And in 1996, we saw DOMA, the Defense of Marriage Act, which federally defined marriage as between one man and one woman. Over time, we saw a lot of protests against these two things. They were very exclusive of LGBTQIA plus folks, and generally over time, the American community recognized that this was not inclusive. It was not the way that we like to treat people here. And there were lots and lots of protests that developed over time in combination with Pride against these two actions. So in 2004, gay marriage was finally recognized. Massachusetts was the first state to legally recognize same-sex marriages. And this was sort of on the back of a very important Supreme Court case in 2003 that found anti-sodomy laws to be unconstitutional. So states could no longer criminalize LGBTQ sexual activity as a crime as of 2003. So over time, in the early 2000s, we saw many, many states follow Massachusetts' lead, all the way up until 2013, where DOMA was repealed. The Defense of Marriage Act was repealed on the federal level, which demanded recognition of same-sex marriages across the United States. This was incredibly important and a really wonderful step forward to being able to recognize legally the importance and the beauty of LGBTQIA plus families. Let's hear a little bit more about the AIDS epidemic, how folks dealt with it, and specifically that incredibly beautiful AIDS memorial quilt in the 1980s.
Vision, and it ended up becoming, I believe, I talked about this idea for a whole year and everybody told me it was the stupidest thing they'd ever heard of. But I ignored them and kept going and found people who shared the vision, and it ended up becoming, I believe, the world's largest community arts project ever.
A quilt commemorating 40,000 people who've died from AIDS has gone on display in Washington.
Quilts traditionally were made from cast-offs, taking scraps of fabric that are of different colors and different textures and sewing them into something that is warm and comforting. I thought it would be good therapy for people who were deep in grief. I thought of it also as a tool to help the media understand that behind all of those horrendous statistics were actual human beings that were part of families and communities and neighborhoods. But I was never really prepared for the sheer beauty of it. In the early 1970s, I was one of many thousands of young gay and lesbian kids who got here any way we could. Of course, at that time, it was still a felony to be gay in this country. It was still a felony in California. So we lived under a great deal of repression and fear.
I think, this idea that gays are going to take over city government, I think it's amusing when I hear that.
There were a few blocks within the city where we could be completely free and be ourselves, and that meant you could hold hands with your partner, you could kiss. To come here and to find this vibrant, welcoming community was incredibly exciting.
In 1981, American doctors were baffled by a bizarre disease. Within 6 years, AIDS has spread to 71 countries and infected up to 10 million people.
We're filming this interview at a restaurant called Catch at the corner of Castro and Market Street. I was living just a couple of blocks here when I read those first stories about this new disease. That was the summer of 1982. By the fall of 1985, almost everyone I knew was dead or dying. We very quickly came to understand the signs. People who just a few weeks or months before had been athletic and healthy were suddenly getting these purple lesions. People began to get skinny. We saw people die all around us. On one block in my neighborhood, everybody died in the span of 2 years. Ultimately, over 20,000 gay men would die in this neighborhood. I actually acquired the virus in the winter of 1978, 1979. I did not begin to show signs of that infection until 1992. I got very, very sick very, very quickly and came close to dying in 1994 before I got access to one of the very first clinical trials. I admit there are days when I still feel just overwhelmed by grief. I miss my friends. I miss them a lot. I barely passed high school biology, but I understood clearly that there was no such thing as a gay virus, and that what we were experiencing here was going to be experienced by all sorts of different kinds of people all around the planet. I remember one day exclaiming in rage to my friend, you know, if this was a meadow with 1,000 corpses rotting in the sun, then people would look at this, they would see it. So each panel is 3 feet by 6 feet, the approximate size of a grave. And that was deliberate. I wanted to show how much land would be covered if all of these bodies were lined up head to toe. By October 11th of 1987, we had collected 1,920 individual panels, and they were placed on the National Mall in Washington, D.C., and ended up on the front page of just about every newspaper in the world. Once people could see what I was talking about, then they kind of got the power of it. This quilt is a pretty extraordinary testament to what we went through, and it's a place that's known for its monuments. They're made out of stone and steel, and we took a monument there that was made of cloth and thread and sewn by ordinary Americans and people from all over this planet who loved someone who died of AIDS and wanted them to be remembered. It was that simple and that amazing.
Really appreciate this first person story, and seeing the monument gets to me every time. One of the saddest pieces of that AIDS epidemic, other than the fact that folks were dying left and right and completely ignored by the medical system, was that when these people died, many of them who had been estranged from their families didn't have someone to recognize them in their death. And so there was this absolutely terrible common experience where folks who had passed away from AIDS, who didn't have anyone else, were essentially tossed in a mass grave, sectioned off, specifically those who had HIV versus those who did not, because the folks who were doing the burying were terrified that they would be able to acquire the disease even from those who had already passed. It's a really dark part of our history, and it's incredibly important to recognize how resilient the people are who survived this really, really difficult piece of queer history. So the other piece that I would like to share with you is around how Pride has changed through the ages and maybe how it hasn't. So this video will talk to us a bit about Stonewall itself, about how Pride has evolved, and why it is so incredibly important to keep those early messages of resistance in our Pride celebrations.
June is Pride Month, a time for the LGBTQ+ community to celebrate their culture and history. The Pride movement began with the Stonewall riots 52 years ago this June 28th, but since then it has grown and evolved far beyond parades and protests. In this digital exclusive, executive producer Tony Dunn gets a lesson on the legacy and impact of Pride from historian Kevin Henderson.
Well, the origin of Pride in America starts with the Stonewall Riots. And the Stonewall Riots happened the night of June 27th, early morning of June 28th in 1969. Now, the Stonewall Riots, sometimes called the Stonewall Uprising, was 3 days of riots against police violence that happened in the Greenwich Village of New York City. And it began when police began raiding the gay bar, the Stonewall Inn. The Stonewall Inn was a gay bar that catered to a lower class clientele of gay, lesbian, bisexual, and transgender people. And there were laws on the books in New York City at the time that forbade cross-dressing. And often when police would come in, they would line up anybody who was wearing clothes of the opposite sex. So drag queens, transgender people were often targeted. And if you were found to be wearing more than one article of clothing of the opposite sex, you were often put in the paddy wagon and taken away. This particular night in June, the patrons of the Stonewall Inn fought back. They started throwing coins and rocks at the police. The police became barricaded inside the bar, and local residents, because there was a large population of gay people who lived in the Greenwich Village, barricaded the police in, and then there was a series of confrontations over 3 days. A year later, the Gay Liberation Front, along with other groups, were looking for a way to commemorate the Stonewall Riots. Now, there were other riots and uprisings, police confrontations across the United States before 1969. But the Stonewall Riots had gotten the most press. News had circulated across the United States about them.
It was a turning point.
It was a turning point. But a turning point in a way that wouldn't have happened unless people said, okay, let's make this a turning point. So oftentimes gay history is talked about kind of pre and post Stonewall. But we have to remember too that a lot of effort, that first Pride March or Pride Parade was made to commemorate it and do something that hadn't really been done before. So the Gay Liberation Front organized this march. They called other cities and said, hey, do you guys want to do this with us? Will you commemorate this event with us in a particular way? And that first Pride March happened in 1970 and became an annual ritual that still continues today.
So today, how important is the concept of pride to the LGBTQ community?
It's really important. The word pride itself was used because there is so much shame around sexuality, particularly gay, lesbian, bisexual, and other kinds of alternative sexualities. And that shame certainly has not gone away. So pride is an important way of saying we're not going to be ashamed anymore of who we are. That there's a place for us in larger society. But pride also is not just about kind of throwing off shame or a response to larger society or larger heterosexual society, but it's also the way in which gay people, gay, lesbian, bisexual, transgender people conduct internal politics. So every year at Pride, there's also not only protests, against the Pride Parade and a response against that by conservatives or anti-LGBT forces, but every year there are also all kinds of internal conflicts and internal protests because Pride is also display and a making of what it means to be gay, lesbian, bisexual, and transgender.
So America's perception of and engagement with the LGBTQ community has changed certainly in the 50 years since Stonewall. How have celebrations of and expressions of pride changed along with it over the past 50 years? Right,
that's a good question. Well, one thing that is really clear is that the early years, starting in 1970, of the Gay Pride March was organized by a set of radicals who were very much concentrated on not only fighting homophobia, but also were very concentrated on fighting war, imperialism, racism, and sexism. So the Gay Liberation Front was inspired by other radical movements that were being formed in the late 60s, early 70s, like the Black Panthers, like National Liberation Fronts in North Africa and Vietnam. Many of them were inspired by the anti-war movement against Vietnam. And so there was a strong sense of radicality the first few years of the parade. People often remark that pride parades take on a more celebratory tone, but that is also a source of conflict. Every year in New York, for example, there's a big question. Is this a march or is this a parade? And what's the difference between a march and a parade? Can a parade be a protest? Can a march be celebratory? One of the things that gay, lesbian, bisexual, and transgender people do is contest binary categories, contest boundaries. And so one of the things that the Pride Parade does is kind of blur the lines between a political march and a parade that might be thought as merely a celebration.
Would you call Pride a uniquely American institution? Has it been exported overseas? Or is it, did the seed certainly start here? If so, if it has moved overseas?
Right. Pride quickly actually moved overseas, and Stonewall is also the origin point for other kinds of pride parades. So in Germany, for example, many of the pride parades are called Christopher Street parades because the Stonewall Inn is on Christopher Street. So in Europe and other parts of the world, Stonewall is still the referent point, and their pride parades largely happen in June.
Has Pride been commercialized at all? Has it taken on a commercial aspect? And if so, is that a good or bad thing?
That's another really good question. Pride certainly has been accused of becoming overly commercialized. This year in particular, it seems there has been an explosion of rainbows everywhere we go, from Target, entire shopping malls lined with rainbows. And certainly, if you go to a pride parade, there's many corporations that are sponsoring floats. And even in some cities, corporations have sponsored the naming of the parade itself. And this has led to a number of internal debates, protests, and contests. So for example, last year in Pittsburgh, the Pride Parade was sponsored by the fracking company EQT, which does not stand for equality, but again, is a fracking company. And many gay, lesbian, bisexual, transgender activists said, why is a company that is degrading the environment sponsoring a pride parade? And so they held an alternative march that did not include any kinds of corporations. We've also seen this happen over the years in New York City. So this year in New York City, there's a group called the Reclaim Pride Coalition, which is hosting an alternative march that does not include any corporations, and it's a direct protest against the corporatization of pride.
So clearly, in the past 50 years, America's acceptance of LGBTQ folk has grown exponentially. I mean, there is a vast difference between the way things are now and the way they used to be. As you mentioned, there are still strides to go as well. But what would you say, has Pride, is it still as important now as it was in the past?
Absolutely, it's important now as in the past. And partly, as I said before, it's because gay pride as a ritualized event is a way in which gay, lesbian, bisexual, transgender people come not only to celebrate themselves, to make a statement to larger society, but also to engage in conflict among themselves, right? To say, who are we? Where are we going? Who do we want to be? Do we want gay, lesbian, transgender, bisexual identity to be a consumer identity? Should it be a more radical kind of identity? Who's included? Who's not included? What kind of issues are important to us? And Pride is our time to talk about these things, to debate them, and enact them through the ritual of the parade.
June.
All right, so a few more pieces of the timeline here. So we talked about how Pride is still incredibly important today because there are still challenges going on today. So this slide gets into the 2010s and all of the complicated things that happened during this sort of current timeline. So the first piece that I want to point out is in 2016. Unfortunately, at that time, we were seeing a lot of challenges to LGBTQ rights. We saw an explosion of anti-trans sentiment when we saw North Carolina introduce a anti-trans bathroom bill that was promptly shut down, which is definitely a good thing, but it took some time and it took a lot of protests to get that off the books. Also in 2016, we saw the Pulse nightclub shooting. This was an LGBTQIA plus nightclub in Florida that was attacked by a gunman who killed 49 people and wounded 53 more. This is an incredibly traumatic event collectively for the LGBTQIA plus community. 2017 saw the first Trump administration. So during this first administration, we saw mentions of LGBTQIA plus people removed from government websites. We saw legal guidance supporting trans inclusion reversed, sort of quickly and dramatically. Luckily, that got reversed during the Biden administration. So he introduced the Respect for Marriage Act to protect all marriages. He reinstated transgender troops who were banned by the first Trump administration. And during this Biden administration, we saw an incredible increase in anti-trans legislation on the state level. It started with bathrooms, expanded to sports and healthcare, even defining sex in a way that is completely exclusive of transgender and intersex individuals. Now we get to 2025. Right now we are sitting in the second Trump administration, and it is full of challenges for LGBTQIA plus folks. We have seen literally hundreds of anti-LGBTQIA plus bills introduced at both the state and the federal level. We've seen attempts to remove trans people from basically all public life. We've seen anti-LGBTQIA plus hate crimes increase dramatically, not only in general public life, but specifically in K-12 schools. We've seen bans introduced for medical care for transgender youth. We've seen bathroom bans and sports bans. Project 2025 outlines almost a complete removal of LGBTQIA plus people from public life. There is a lot going on right now, and it is a fairly scary time for LGBTQIA plus folks. So I do have a video here. This is some context from a lawyer with the ACLU on anti-trans legislative and cultural shifts that have been prompted by transphobic leadership.
As you know, the last month has really been characterized for trans people by one attack after another from this administration. And we started these attacks during the campaign when the president and the Republican Party spent hundreds of millions of dollars focusing on attack ads targeting trans people. And now, post January 20th, it seems like every day there is some new executive action restricting the rights of trans people and really zeroing in on efforts to prevent us from having jobs, going to the bathroom, going to school, joining the military, accessing healthcare. This is really a full-scale assault on trans people being able to really live freely in this country. And so for the trans community, this is a time of great anxiety and fear and concern for the future. For me, in terms of what I am looking at, I am most scared about these continued erosions into our ability to access essential things like healthcare, but that's also something that many people in this country are worried about. Will Medicaid be cut? Will we continue to see the executive unilaterally try to cut off grant funding that Congress has allocated to institutions, to the states? So this is a time of significant precarity, and I'm very concerned about the sustainability of our separation of powers in this country, as well as the ability of trans people to survive in the face of these attacks.
Grace mentioned, this is an incredibly difficult time for the transgender community, and unfortunately, we are not the only people being attacked. There are so many things going on at the federal level that can negatively impact the people who live in the United States. Not only LGBTQIA plus folks, but there's definitely a significant impact on our community specifically.
As you know,
lastly, I want to show a little bit about what specifically is going on with the transgender community. So this slide will show several news headlines around some of the things that the transgender community has been experiencing over the last year. Some of these are specific to our area, some of them are federal, some of them have occurred in other states. But all of them have an incredibly difficult and painful impact on the transgender people that they are targeting. Okay. So a little bit of the details on some of these challenges going on. There is a significant increase in anti-trans legislation around restroom use. So this is a map of the United States as of about 4 days ago, and what is kind of going on with these laws. So these laws specifically prevent transgender people from using sex-segregated spaces according to their gender identity. Each state has a different take on this, and so I want to go over sort of what the landscape looks like right now. There are 6 states currently that ban transgender people from using bathrooms in all government-owned buildings. This includes K-12 schools, colleges, courtrooms, post offices, anything that is owned by the government. Folks are not allowed to utilize the restroom that aligns with their gender identity. 6 states. In 7 states, we have state bans on trans folks using the restroom in K-12 schools and some government-owned buildings. So this may include, for example, the jail, the courthouse, and the state house, but not the post office or the Medicaid office. Then we have 6 different states that ban appropriate use of the restroom specifically and only in those K-12 schools. So far that is 6 plus 7 is 13, plus another 6 is 19 different states that ban folks utilizing the restrooms, at least in K-12 schools, if not in other government buildings. And then we have 31 states, 5 territories, and DC that do not have that sort of ban. Some of them may not have any language whatsoever on the state level. Some of them may have protections on the state level, and some of them may have bans on the city level rather than the state. This is why somehow Rhode Island and Texas are the same color, because Texas does not have bans on the state level, but there are many, many, many bans on the city level in Texas. So then there are also 2 other little indicators on this map. There's the red exclamation point that is in 2 states where the state law makes it a criminal offense for trans folks to use that restroom. Oftentimes this is considered a felony, especially there in Florida. And then the yellow exclamation point has, this is indicating a state that defines sex in a way that impacts trans folks' ability to use the restroom. So for example, in Kansas, they don't specifically have a ban on trans restroom use, but they define male and female as immutable and based on what is on your original birth certificate. So this means folks who were assigned female at birth, who have transitioned, who look like me, must still use the women's restroom because that is, quote, their sex. These types of bans do not only impact transgender people, they impact cisgender people very negatively as well. One of the things that frequently happens with these bans is that cisgender folks will be targeted because they are perceived as transgender. So we have seen, for example, in Boston, where there is no bathroom ban whatsoever, a cisgender lesbian was kicked out of the restroom in a hotel because she was assumed to be male, even though there is not even a ban in that state. This map looks at gender-affirming medical care for youth specific. So there have been dozens of attacks on care for transgender youth, both sort of hormonal care as well as surgical care, which in and of itself is extremely rare. So going through this map, we have 14 states plus DC that have specifically shield laws. These protect their residents' access to gender-affirming healthcare. Then there are 2 other states that have sort of that shield law in executive order form rather than as law. So that is 16 states plus DC that specifically protect access to gender-affirming care. Then there are 8 states and 5 territories that sort of have nothing. There's no ban and there's no protection. We have 2 states currently that ban surgical care for transgender youth specifically. And then we have 25 states that ban both best practice medical and surgical care for transgender youth. 2 of those states currently are blocked by a court ruling. And then we have 6 states that make it a felony crime to provide gender-affirming medical care for young people. The landscape is terrifying, and folks are having to move out of the states that they've lived in order to access life-saving, life-sustaining medical care. And this medical care is supported by all of the major medical, psychological, and psychiatric associations in the United States. Science is there, the doctors support this type of care, and unfortunately, our political system does not. This is another map. This is thinking more about legal transition. So this map talks about whether or not folks can change the gender marker on their birth certificates. That is that M, F, or X that is listed to indicate someone's sex. So starting from the top with the positives, we have 16 states plus DC that do allow residents to mark M, F, or X on their birth certificates. X is a really important inclusion because it includes intersex folks whose bodies may not match what doctors expect specifically for male or female, but it's also much more inclusive of non-binary people who don't identify as male or female. We have 14 states that have a really easy administrative process for changing that gender marker on a birth certificate. It doesn't require any provider documentation, and it's fairly simple. We have 11 states plus 1 territory in DC that do allow updates on birth certificates with a pretty specific administrative process, but it does require provider documentation of appropriate treatment, which usually means that someone is on hormones, but in the past has been interpreted to include specific surgeries in order to qualify for a change. Those are a little bit more unclear, and each state has a different sort of specific for what constitutes appropriate treatment. Then we have 6 states and 3 territories that have a really unclear process, and may have unclear medical requirements that are left to the discretion of a judge. 3 states allow updates on birth certificates but do require proof of surgery. 8 states require both a court order and proof of surgery. And then 8 states do not allow for the amending of a gender marker on a birth certificate whatsoever. Additionally, unfortunately, we have 3 states that specifically ban the use of an X gender marker on birth certificates, completely erasing the identities of intersex folks. So this is really challenging. Not only does lack of representation and ability to change your gender marker on your birth certificate negatively impact trans folks because it's just unaffirming, it also creates significant danger. When you are doing things like applying for jobs or traveling, and you have to have multiple forms of ID, if those things do not match, it is incredibly dangerous. Sometimes folks may be arrested. Sometimes folks may be unable to participate in whatever it is that they were trying to do. Maybe you're not allowed to get on that flight, or you are not able to obtain the job that you were trying to obtain based on this mismatch in your documentation. It also leads to problems with housing, with applying for benefits, and many, many other things. Think about all of those different ways that you might utilize your birth certificate or your legal documentation, like your state ID and your passport. Any time in which you have to utilize those things, if they don't all match, it creates a significant problem for that person. And we are now seeing folks unable to update their passports, or reapply for a new one or renew them because they're being sent back with incorrect gender markers if folks have applied for a change in the past. So, what can we do? LGBTQIA plus communities are incredibly resilient and strong and creative and inclusive. We are under attack right now, and we're struggling with other stigmatization. Things like continued lack of representation. It's not incredibly common to see LGBTQIA plus folks in leadership positions or in the media or being celebrated publicly. We're fighting poor medical care, lack of access to medical care, and misunderstanding by our medical providers. And unfortunately, when we think about elders, there are additional complications like loneliness and isolation, and this internal conflict about whether or not someone needs to go back into the closet in their elder years for their own safety when they enter congregate care. So, in this very complex position where we have made incredible progress and also are still really struggling, how can we continue to thrive and push for equity and celebrate that massive progress that our community has made? Firstly, I encourage you to call your representatives, send them emails, or chat with them, and share your opinions on local, state, and federal actions, such as anti-transgender legislation and the removal of bodily autonomy. Whether you are in support or against these actions, it is important that your government representatives know how you feel so that they can represent you appropriately. We can create or join mutual aid networks to support other queer folks. We both receive and provide support through these mutual aid networks. You want to make sure that you are covered legally as well. And this entirely depends on your personal situation. So we want to make sure that all of these things are updated, they are reflecting what we want reflected. So things like passports, wills, powers of attorney, advance directives, marriage licenses, birth certificates, adoption paperwork, and so much more. All of those legal documents should be as up to date as humanly possible. And we do encourage folks to have multiple copies of them, especially put into what we call a safe folder, which is kind of your emergency grab and go. If something were to happen, it's all right there in one place that you can take with you. I also encourage folks to connect with intergenerational LGBTQIA plus groups and events. It is so incredibly powerful to be able to meet with folks that are from entirely different generations from you. Personally, I'm a millennial, and I had a wonderful experience recently of joining this incredible group from Pride and Aging who were talking about aging in intersex and two-spirit contexts. And I, for the first time ever, got to meet a survivor of the New York AIDS epidemic. This person introduced himself, told his story about being present at Stonewall, of being present for the AIDS epidemic, and participating in the creation of the AIDS Memorial Quilt. I was in tears the moment I met him and was so incredibly starstruck because it is rare to find elders who were out and present at that time, who are still engaged in activism. And it was so incredibly moving to be able to have that connection with those elders. So lastly, we want to celebrate progress and remember that Pride is a protest. We can both celebrate and push for progress at the same time. So thank you so much for joining me to talk about Pride and our LGBTQIA plus history. I really appreciate your time and attention, and I hope to see you at our next celebration.